Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another episode of Brothers in Christ. It's Testimony Tuesday or Testimony Thursday. I'll decide that when I post it. But frankly, I'm joined by a very special guest, someone I just met for the first time very recently. Johnny, thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. So I met you really last week at this thing called Contact House Party.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, our mutual friend came to us and introduced us, and he basically said that you had a good testimony or something, and that maybe you'd like to come on, and you just came on the following week. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, of course, it's a blessing to be here. Blessing to talk about what God's done for me and all the goodness I've seen.
Well, so I know very little about you, but I'm down to know so much more, and really that's what you're here to talk about. So I guess let's go back to the beginning. Where did this all start?
Yeah, so I suppose I was raised in church. My parents were both Christians by the time I was born. But I wasn't particularly deep in thought. I didn't question much. It was only when I was a sort of young teenager that I started concerning myself with, what does everyone think? How do Christians get treated? Do I have any friends here? And I think, for a whole host of reasons, I was a bit weird. You know what I mean? Like I think everyone at 14 thinks they're a bit weird, but I think I thought so, maybe more than most. I thought when I was at little church youth groups and stuff, I couldn't really get along with anyone. I thought it was a little bit hard. I just couldn't sort of relate to them because I thought they were all a bit sort of straight-laced and a bit too proper, and I was into sort of horror movies and punk rock and whatever else, which I don't think are necessarily bad, but with things like I would swear in casual conversation, and they would look at me that's a bit shocking, which was, I just felt like a bit of an alien, and I suppose I definitely had work to do even back then, but it wasn't. I wouldn't say that was good, because I think you'd be really surprised how quickly the sort of call of God in your life can sort of get drowned out if you're not in that kind of community. I think, so I stopped going to church, for instance. I stopped going to youth groups. And that kind of really unleashed me to just sort of do whatever I liked at age, 15, 16? Which it sounds so crazy, because I was big into apologetics and sort of academic reasons for believing in God. But I think what you'll find is knowing about God's existence from an academic perspective is not really ever been enough to actually sort of keep one in faith. It sort of reminds me sometimes of the whole episode in Exodus with the golden calf, right? Because these are sort of Israelites who have seen the sea split. They've got the clearest reason anyone could ever have for I believe that God is there and he cares for me. But then as soon as the one real sort of man of God, Moses, leaves up the mountain, they forget. And they just chase after whatever it is that they want. I think I can tell you from experience that is quite real. I think it's good to be kind of on alert for how quickly you can forget about all the goodness of God and all that he might have done for you. Because the next few years for me, I would say I was a Christian if I wanted to sort of argue with my friends who were atheists, but pretty much at no other time. I certainly wasn't interested in anything that the Bible had to say. I didn't really care about the fact that God might want to correct any of my behavior. I was certainly a big drinker. I was pretty mean. I was sort of, I don't know. I was living in a way that I think was certainly very far from God, but I had no even sort of thought, no contemplation that God would ever have anything to say to me. Because I thought, he's up there, unrelatable. I'm down here. He probably doesn't mind anyway. And that went on, and it got worse and worse. Then when I was on my gap year after school finished. I was about 19. I was hearing about from all my friends, who I used to get drunk with, about all their experiences going to university as this time when you just get completely the chains come off, you go crazy. And they seem to be having a lot of fun. And I thought, wow, well, that'll be cool. I'm, hyped for September when I get to go wild like that. And yeah, I think, crazy as it sounds, luckily for me, I caught a pretty bad illness. It's called a viral dysautonomia, I believe. It's basically a weird complication from long COVID. It means a lot of things. It means that you get tired really easily. So I had a good few days where I didn't really leave bed. Your heart goes crazy, so you can't really stand up very well. You certainly couldn't run around. My resting heart rate sometimes was something like 180. It was crazy, so I always thought I was maybe on the cusp of having a heart attack, especially because I got all these weird pains. And I never considered it religiously. I didn't think, this is some kind of punishment. I just thought, this sucks. I wish I wasn't here. I wish that my opportunity to go have fun hadn't been taken away from me. Because, getting out and being active was way out. That seemed suicidal. Alcohol also has a big effect on the way your heart works. So that was way out as well. I went to the hospital a few times. I spent a good long time trying to sort of see various doctors, trying to see what this was. Because at the time I didn't even know. And I thought, I remember once after a sort of particularly bad day of it, where all my plans had been sort of scuppered by the fact that I couldn't really move or do anything, I said to my mum, I think, do you think I might be cursed? And she was like, well, she didn't really engage with that because no one wants to think about things like that. But I think it's a question worth engaging with as to what that would even mean. If we define a curse as something that comes from God that is harmful to you, then I think there's plenty of good reason and plenty of purpose and a lot of joy that comes at the end after things that seem really painful. And I didn't understand this at the time. I was just angry and sort of bitter and frustrated that my ability to sort of go off the chain had been taken from me. But then I went to university at the end, and I was still ill, and I found myself unable to do any of the sort of things that I might have liked to do to sort of get in that kind of crazy worldly living. So I went to Christian stuff, basically just because those were the only people who weren't, whose socials didn't involve getting drunk, who didn't need to sort of do anything super active, and just because I wanted to sort of at least talk to someone. And Freshers Week can be pretty lonely in that regard. And I remember the first day after I showed up at uni, I went to a church just down the road, just the only one within sort of what was walking distance for me, which is 100 meters or something. And yeah, they were preaching on the book of James, chapter 1, the first few verses, which says, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, when you face trials of many kinds, because the testing of your faith produces patience." And yeah, I know I was caught off guard because I hadn't taken church seriously in ages. And it felt like the sort of preacher was really kind of cooking me. And I sort of came to see that there's plenty of good that can come out of a curse, if you want to call it that, that I basically like a loving father, I couldn't really be trusted with my freedom. So I didn't get it. And I'm grateful now for everything that I've learned in being ill, because it's such a sort of weakening experience. If you think that you're on top of the world, I can do whatever I like, I'm going to go crazy. Suddenly not being able to leave bed is a real it's a real shock. But you realize how weak you are, and you realize how much hope and trust and joy you've put into things that are completely here one day and gone the next day. And you realize almost how silly you've been to put so much value in things that are so temporary, because you were only ever going to lose it anyway. There's a lot of good books about that. I don't want to go on a tangent, but there's a book called Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, where he's this psychologist who talks about, he was in the concentration camps in the war, and he talks about how the kind of person that you became under that sort of pressure was reflective of where you put your trust. So a lot of the people who were, the inmates, would just sort of shut down, collapse in a corner, wait to die. They seemingly had no hope in anything at all. A lot of people became mean. They would steal, they would collaborate with the Germans, they would sort of get into fights. They were people who had placed their faith in things that were still right there to them, right? Like their reputation, their wealth, their families even. But just like they were holding onto something and thought, I can't lose this, I'll kill for it. And there are people who he calls sort of honorable, who were sort of still concerned with helping people and were seemingly sort of irrepressible in terms of their hope and their spirit. And that was the people who were motivated by kind of spiritual things. You know what I mean? And I've seen that. I wouldn't dare say that I've ever been through anything that bad. But it's very easy when you lose something that like, oh, this is my source of joy. I mean, anything that's here on earth that's fleeting will be taken away from you. And if your joy gets taken away with it, well, then it wasn't good to begin with. And I think sometimes it takes that kind of humbling to see that come to you. You know what I mean? So now I came back to God, and I then continued with this illness for 2 years, 3 years, something like that, which is minorly frustrating, right? There's a lot of things that I would have wanted to do but not been able to do. Little holidays, little trips, little sports things. But it's so clear to me that God will use your pain to do something good, to turn you into the person that he wants you to be. That none of this is meaningless. So I've often prayed, God, may this last for as long as you still have things to teach me. And I think, by the grace of God, I'm now out of the woods there. I think I'm better. I don't know exactly. I'll have to do some more tests. It's been a while since I got my blood drawn. But if it is, then I thank God for his sort of way that he's transformed me, transformed my kind of way of thinking about him, my kind of mindset. And if it's not, then I still praise God, and I'm excited for what more I have to sort of learn about how I'm supposed to be.
Yeah, and really, I mean, you said, well, there's a lot of key moments here. So during it's all right. So the first thing I want to touch on is frankly how you would argue for God's existence against your atheist friends, but you didn't really care about having a relationship with God. Is that?
Yeah.
And really during that time, and then when at church in your university, when you say God starts cooking you, basically, what was the transformation? Well, what was that period like? First of all, going back to your faith with God, but also having to leave. Well, I'm not sure if you had to leave, but really, Did you face any negative criticism from your friends who you were getting drunk with at the time, or like was any conviction there?
So, yeah, I mean, I suppose the first thing is, yeah, I used to just argue because I liked being right. I liked sort of anything that I thought was sort of intellectually stimulating. I didn't think there was any, I thought relationship was for people who were a bit more sort of feely, or it was a bit sort of immaterial. I liked sort of arguing about history because it just seemed like something worth talking about. But it never occurred to me even that the answer to the question might be deeper, and it might actually have to, that it might actually bear up the way you live your life. You know what I mean? Yeah, then how do I see my friends now? I still see those friends a lot. I think none of them have really bothered me. I think, 21, I think you'd be surprised how accepting people are of Christianity these days. I think a lot of people are sort of searching for kind of meaning and truth and looking for something that can give them purpose in their lives. And Christianity is the obvious thing to look to because it's the kind of ideology that built our whole civilization. So yeah, I think I've had a lot of really good conversations with them. I still see them a lot. Some of them more interested, some of them aren't. Everyone's got valid questions, valid concerns. But I've never really felt ashamed, and I've never felt like, when they do drugs and I don't want to do them anymore. Like, I've never felt bullied or anything for that. I think people are quite understanding of that, which is one of the nicer things. It makes it quite comfortable. You should be willing to sacrifice for God, but it's easier to come to him if you don't feel like you necessarily do. Like, your friends all have to be cut out of the picture. I think there can be a lot of really powerful witness in that as well.
Yeah, I do agree with that. A lot of, as Christians, we get quite, you could say, nervous about spreading our faith, or like to our friends, and then when we do it, you realise they don't really, it's not like they don't really care, but it's not something that offends them. They'll still accept you, which is most of the time, well, in my personal experience anyway.
Yeah.
I'm so really, you're still in university, right?
Yes, going for my 4th year.
Alright, so how has your walk with Christ been since really, like, let's just say that, without moment when you started taking faith seriously after that church?
Yeah, it's been great. I think, I've found a really great community of people who, I think basically that's what I was missing. It feels so silly to say that my beliefs on, not really is God real, but should I live for God, would be in any way related to, like, what do my friends think? But that's the reality of things. I think we're all social creatures. So back home, when I was 14, 15, I didn't have any Christian friends. I didn't have the faintest interest in living the way God want me to. And going to university, you're suddenly thrown in with a whole sort of ocean of people, and they all cluster into these little societies of people who have the same interests or the same beliefs. So I joined the Christian Union. I can't recommend that enough. If anyone's going to university, it's a really great way to get into a group of people who will sort of build each other up and help them on their walk, and found a lot of really wise answers to a lot of the questions that were kind of nagging me for years. So yeah, no, it's been great. I think you can make a lot of great friends. It's not good for a man to be alone, right? That's talking about women talking about animals, but like that's in a general sense, that's still true. It's a really great thing if you can find yourself a community of people who are gonna like build each other up.
There's going to be probably most of your Christian friends and Christians who are watching this. What would your testimony really, like the main message of it to be like out of it? One thing you wanted to take away from it?
I suppose to Christians, I would ask not to despair when something rough happens. I think everyone's going to go through sort of periods of, stormy weather. And I think that can be a bit confusing. Well, it can be confusing depending on your doctrine of suffering, right? Like what you think is actually happening when something bad's going on. I suppose if you're an atheist, you're asking why to suffering is sort of silly. It's like asking why to gravity, right? It just is. I've had one very common belief that I think is kind of just annoying in the sense that it sort of seems to linger on even though it's not biblical, is that all our problems come from like devils, like, you know, something bad will happen and they'll say, you know, the devil's had his way with me, or something like that. I would say get rid of that teaching if you can, because first of all, there's no comfort in the belief that God's just let devils have their way with you. It's not even clear really what you would do there. You would just sort of say, well, like, that sucks. Oh well, you know what I mean? It doesn't lead to repentance. It doesn't change your character. It doesn't give you any hope. You basically just sort of think, well, I'll wait for them to be finished. Yeah, so I think if you can remember that God really does care for you and know you and love you personally, then it's easy to start thinking, like your first question is, you know, what might God have to teach me here? Like, is there some kind of way that is there something about myself that I need to let go of, that God's trying to show me is sort of temporary, right? You know, is there, well, it's like John the Baptist says, right? Like, I must decrease, he must increase. You can see a bit, I think that's often the message, is that I mean, not to say that all suffering is punishment, but I think none of it's purposeless. You know what I mean? I think there's been a lot of good, for not just for me, but all sorts of people going through rough times. It reminds me of, I'm sorry, I don't want to be too long-winded, but Lamentations 3 is, I think, one of my favorite chapters in the Old Testament. I think most people know the verses 21, 22. It says, you know, because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed. His compassions fail not. They are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. But what's interesting is the whole chunk before that is sort of like this guy complaining about what God has done to him. You know, it says like he has led me into darkness, not into light. He was like a bear lying in wait for me to rip me apart. It says he was like an archer and he set me as a target for his arrows. And it's a lot of like it's language, frankly, that people, you might not think you're allowed to talk about God like that. But it's certainly saying, like, you know, this wasn't devils, this wasn't anything else. God has done this to me for one reason or another. And then, you know, his mercy is new every morning. Which is a real sort of shift in tone. And the way it squares those two things that seemingly contradict is in the next bit, where it says something that's, I think, really quite hard to swallow, but it's quite important. Which is that it is good for a man to bear a yoke while he is young, which is pretty hard to take sometimes. And it's easily misinterpreted, I think, because you can say, oh, good for a man to bear a yoke, like in a sort of what doesn't kill me makes me stronger kind of way, like just toughen up, you know what I mean? But that's not it. It's because it's good to bear a yoke because it's going to crush you to death, right? Because you will see that you are too weak to handle life on your own. And you'll get crushed. You'll die with Christ and rise with him. That's the symbolism behind baptism. So yeah, it's and then it goes on, and there's more to say, but I don't want to drag on. But yeah, I would say look for purpose, look for instructions. Don't assume that God's given up on you, because, you know, like 1 Peter says, often trials are like gold being refined in furnaces. It's like it'll purify you. Like James says, it'll build patience. I think a lot of the times almost blessings and curses are the same sides of the same coin, in that you will end up glorifying and rejoicing in God regardless of the like material outcome, the material immediate consequence of God's acting in your life. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Wow. I mean, I must say, you should do more public speaking because you're really captivating.
Thank you.
Wow. And also, you don't even have a Bible right now. So biblical knowledge is really good.
Yeah, I came here to show off.
Biblical knowledge is really good. Man. So this is my first proper interaction with you. And my days, your testimony is, first of all, I relate to a lot of things you were saying there, especially the early years, really 14 to 15. I don't know about you, but I surrounded myself with a lot of non-believers as well, a lot of brothers and sisters in Christ. So frankly, getting into debates with them, I mean, I didn't really care for looking into our argument from emotion or something like that. So I would get destroyed most of the time. But frankly, I think your testimony is definitely going to help people watching, because there is definitely so many Christians who have gone through that phase of, you could say, rebellion, and really saying I'm a Christian, just arguing from a philosophical perspective, and not actually having a relationship with God. So frankly, it's really nice to see that change what God did in your life, because like you said in that church service when you were reading the first chapters of James, that seems like a pivotal moment really, and James is one of my favourite books in the Bible.
Yeah,
So
right.
frankly, wow, really. And I mean, before we end it off, you already gave a message you already said what you would want Christians to get from your testimony. Before we end off the testimony, is there anything else you'd like to touch on or add to, because it's going to be Christians and non-believers watching this. So is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah. I guess to both, I might say, like, do you want peace? Like, I feel like that's what I've found here, is a sense that I've sort of lost control over the exact way to, I found my purpose, I think. I found what purpose is. I found what the source of purpose is. And, our purpose is ultimately to live by grace. Right? Grace, if we want to define it as anything, would be the allowing God's sort of overwhelming love to completely sort of drown out and just completely overwhelm any ability of yours to struggle and work and toil to be good and be happy and be satisfied on your own terms. Like, that'll give you peace. I mean, that's what it's all about, right? Like, that's Paul's last words at the end of 2 Timothy, which is right when he's about to die. His last sentence is, grace be with you. He's lived this amazing life, and he's got so much sort of insight into the nature of God and the nature of what we're really here to do. And he says, it's all grace. That's the secret. And he's happy dying, he's happy living, he's happy preaching in good times or in bad times. Because he's living by grace, and that's an example I can only ever dream to follow. I don't think I always really understand it. But yeah, if you are living by grace, you know that you've been completely sort of, God's love for you is just overwhelming. Then, like, you're all in, right? Because God's been all in for you first. So that's, I guess, the open option is just, do you want that? And that's something that might take your whole life to figure out, but it is good.
And really, I once again have to say thank you for sharing really what God's done in your life and is doing in your life. Is there anything really, like, we, brothers and sisters in Christ watching this and here right now, could pray for you about for the time to come? Is there anything we need prayer for?
Um, I don't know. I think just like that, I wouldn't lose hope. I suppose it's easy to sort of enter sort of hot seasons and cold seasons, and I feel like because I've known God quite genuinely for the last sort of 3 years now, that I'm sort of like then unshakable, and then that's when the pride comes, and you think, you almost even start to think, I'm actually good, like I'm a good guy on my own, and that's that's the sort of cycle almost. Who knows? But yeah, it's good to not give up, to not get too self-important, but yeah, to know that you're living by grace every minute.
And well, before I end the testimony, I always say this to the Christians watching this. If you're a Christian watching this, I hope that you can see how really God has transformed Johnny's life and how He has helped him through difficult moments, whether that was in the illness or getting drunk with his friends and everything. How He has always been there for Johnny, and I hope really you can see just how really powerful and loving our God is. And if you're a non-believer watching this, really, I understand that this may be odd to you, this God, this Jesus, all this stuff really, but I hope that you can see how really important it is to us, how it's not just a hobby, it's our life, it's the centre of our life, and really how important our faith has in shaping who we are. So, before I end it off, if you're a Christian, pray, because God would speak to you, go to church, pray, or go to a Bible study, listen to some worship music, get yourself a bunch of brothers and sisters in Christ. And this has been your host, your founder, Joel Estrada Castillon, joined by
Johnny.
and I'll see you in the next one.